Final Fantasy VII Remake. The game many had been waiting literal decades for. The holy grail of gaming. One thing I never really heard discussed back when Remake was purely a hypothetical concept was how the battle system would change. And well, it's different. However, I'm genuinely glad that we got this combat system and in this specific way that we did. Yes, I understand that not everybody is thrilled that the combat system isn't just an expansion of the original, and that is a fair complaint. Something like this should be reserved for a new intellectual property and not just be bolted on to FF7. But here's my counter argument. A new IP would not really have the mass market traction to give Square Enix the confidence to invest the amount of money this combat system clearly needed to work. Hell, even if it was a normal mainline Final Fantasy game, we see that Square Enix sometimes won't provide the resources it needs to become fully realized. So yes, this combat system is so good that it is worth building an entire FF7 Remake series around it. Welcome to Combat Comprehensive, the show where I deep dive into video game combat systems. I'm Power Man. I played Final Fantasy VII Remake about a month or two after its initial release, just to see what all the hubbub and hype was about. I personally thought that it was a good game. There definitely was a lot of love and care put into it, but it certainly wasn't perfect or anything. But after my initial playthrough, I started playing on the harder difficulty, and I experimented and messed around with the combat system way more. I found myself really gravitating towards this game. If I could sum up this combat system in one sentence, I would say this combat system feels like the bridge between what was happening when you played the original FF7 and what you were imagining was happening within the game universe. So often playing this game, the switching between characters to do certain things, it really felt like an actionified original Final Fantasy VII. Big, more powerful moves were stuff I was going into the menus for. The smaller stuff I was doing was more action gamey. There's some really smart design decisions built into the foundation of this game, and that's where all of the good stuff of the game is. All of my complaints about what's bad with this game's combat system really has nothing to do with the underlying foundation. It's something like, oh, this thing could have been programmed better, these numbers could have been tweaked, etc., etc. And I think the biggest success of this game is that it simultaneously feels fresh and evokes a lot of modern action games, but walks that nice tightrope of paying homage to those older turn-based Final Fantasy games. These games' mechanics are so well thought out. I actually have some suspicions about the creative leads on this game having really thought for a long time about how they've wanted to do this remake. So many of the mechanics and ideas in this game feel like somebody had conceptualized them and perfected them long before a single line of code was written. I think the best way to show what kind of game 7 Remake is, we have to look at the resumes of many of the creative leads who worked on it. The game's lead combat designer, Teruyuki Endo, had come from working on the Monster Hunter series, where he worked on games from Tri into World. Battle programmer Satoru Koyama had previously worked on Final Fantasy XIII Lightning Returns. And Mitsunori Takahashi, who, while not credited in the game's final credits sequence, we only know he worked on this game from a 2017 Famitsu interview with Yoshinori Katase. He had been making significant contributions to the game's development at some point. Takahashi was also the lead combat designer of a game you might have heard of called Kingdom Hearts 2 and Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix. In fact, Takahashi was kind of a rock star for a short little while there during this game's hype cycle. After that PSX 2015 demo, and prior to the game's 2019 re-unveiling, this single bit of news got so many people excited about 7 Remake. In fact, knowing this, the influences of 7 Remake become way more obvious after the fact. A lot of the slower, more powerful moves in 7 Remake kind of have this Monster Hunter-y kind of quality, especially a lot of Cloud's moves. There definitely feels a little bit of that great sword from Monster Hunter inspiration. Now, despite this game being a remake, I will not really be comparing this game all that much to the original game, because there's inherently different games and inherently there's different genres. There are a few minor things that overlap between the two games, but in general, this game wholly stands on its own, separate from the original. It definitely wears the original's influences on its sleeve, and is very proud of it. This is a great combat system, regardless if you've played original FF7 or not. And arguably the most important thing about this game having a good, solid foundation in the first place is for future remake installments to build on top of. Now, you might be saying, that's kind of a stupid point to give the game, but you'd be surprised at how many Square Enix action games will take a perfectly working combat system that works magically in one installment, throw it out entirely for a completely different and worse combat system in the next game. Now, what I won't be talking about in this video is classic mode, the sort of like combination difficulty mode slash accessibility option slash way the game plays much similar to the original FF7. It's a mode where all of your basic attacks, evades, and blocks are handled by the computer, so you're only really having to menu through. And while I do think that is interesting, it's very clear that the game was not designed for this. So I think if you really want to get the most out of the game, I think going with the real-time version of the game is clearly the intended way to play. Also, for any of you clever people out there who are like, oh, where's Fort Condor? Because Fort Condor is a combat system in the game. Surely you gotta cover it, but it's a mini game in a side story DLC. I think Fort Condor is interesting, although I will admit I'm not really a strategy RPG expert or anything, so I really can't fully break down something like that in general. All right, with all that said, let's get the preliminary stuff with this game out of the way first. Just a bunch of minor miscellaneous things you should know prior to playing the game. Game versions. Now, at the time of me making this video, this game only has two major versions available. There's the original PlayStation 4 release, and then there is the upgraded slash remaster 7 Remake Intergrade. Intergrade has a bunch of new content the PS4 one doesn't. It has the Yuffie side story DLC, and it has a brand new super boss for the main campaign. And Intergrade does have some gameplay changes relative to the PS4 version that have not been publicly talked about by the developers, or at least anywhere I could find. Now, granted, there are just a handful of these changes, and they're really, like, subtle. Really, the main difference between PS4 and Intergrade, I would say, the overall pace, certain moves just come out way faster in Intergrade compared to PS4. And the game just feels a little bit more snappy and responsive as a result. This isn't even just the ability to choose a higher frame rate to play the game in, because even playing at 30 FPS in Intergrade, the game feels faster than base PS4. I want to talk about performance of this game because I think I might say something a little bit unpopular with the PC gaming crowd here. If you're playing a version of the game and you have to choose between 30 FPS and 60 FPS, which one do you choose? I think 7 Remake plays way better at 60 over 30. It has a little bit more punch to it, but it's a little bit extra. I wouldn't say that you need 60 FPS to play this game. That if you're playing at 30, it's actually like almost completely okay. For any of the content in the original PS4 version, none of those enemies or bosses really require that quick of reflexes or twitchy movements on something like anywhere near a Devil May Cry level or even Kingdom Hearts. The only part of the game I feel like you should turn on 60 FPS for is the super boss Weiss. He's so fast and aggressive that having the extra responsiveness definitely makes that fight way less suppressive. But it's not impossible at 30 FPS either. I've beaten Weiss at 30 FPS plenty of times, and for any frame rate above 60 FPS, I don't know, personal taste, I think it's kind of overkill. There's just nothing really that 120 FPS adds to the gameplay experience of 7 Remake where I'm like, yeah, I would definitely turn it on for such and such fight or such and such battle scenario. From a control standpoint, I also feel like the game does a pretty good job, although I think it fumbles like a teeny tiny little bit. The controls are actually pretty easy to understand. Each button really only does like one thing when you're in combat and one thing outside. You're not having a gazillion actions mapped to one button in different directions like a lot of other action games. And much like Kingdom Hearts, this game also has a shortcut system that you can use to put your most frequently used abilities on, and limit breaks? I'm sorry. What? You don't use your limit breaks that often that you need a dedicated shortcut button for. Also, when you get to endgame, you're going to be switching characters a lot, and the default controls put character switching on the D-pad, so you're probably going to have to rearrange your controls when you get to hard mode. Force normal mode playthrough of 7 Remake is going to be fantastic. You get to experience the story as it unfolds, and you will generally get a basic understanding of all of your tools. Charging ATB, what characters' playstyles are, what movement is like, and how to use a party in general. And upon beating normal mode, you get hard mode. The game expects you to learn some of the tools that you might not have had time to experiment with because they were introduced so late into your first playthrough. And it's very clearly intended that hard mode is meant to be played in order from chapter 1 as soon as you clear normal mode chapter 18. I made the mistake of jumping straight into chapter 16 on hard mode right after I beat the game for the first time. And yeah, it definitely wasn't pretty. Especially since hard mode expects you to be at the max level cap of 50 for most of the playthrough. I find the game's difficulty curves on both normal and hard to be pretty nice. Only really huge difficulty spikes I find are Hell House on normal and hard mode, and Sephiroth at the end of hard mode. Although if you know even the slightest amount of what you're doing before you even play the game, you can absolutely breeze through it. See, I played the game on PS4 initially. Then I borrowed a friend's PS5 to play through Intergrade when it came out. Then I rebought the game on PC when that version came out on the Epic Games Store. So I think between all of the versions, I've played the game about 4 to 4.5 times. And even on a brand new save file on a completely different device, with the few tools you get at the start of normal mode, I was absolutely able to crush it on a second normal mode playthrough. But the main game and intermission differ in a weird way though. I never felt underleveled in the main game, going straight through with absolutely no grinding whatsoever. In intermission, that same approach leaves you a bit underleveled to take on that final boss. So I do suggest grinding up Yuffie and Sonon a little bit during your playthrough. I also really appreciate 7 Remake's progression. The actual speed which you acquire new abilities, materia, and so on, and how often your skills are tested by the game feel pretty well tuned, even if I find the game to be very padded sometimes. I do think the amount of material the game can throw at you can be a bit overwhelming if you try to immediately mess with any new materia once it becomes available. While I do think it does take at least 2 playthroughs to really understand how the combat system works and what most of your tools do, there's enough flexibility in the game between level grinding and buying materia that you can mess with stuff at your own pace. Another thing I appreciate about progression is the nice balance the game strikes between the core gameplay feeling the same when you start versus when you end relative to expanding your toolkit. Having Cloud's rolls feel the same, basic attacks feel the same, Braver feels the same. From when I start the game in chapter 1 in normal, all the way to when I'm fighting Weiss, feels pretty good. On the surface, Remake seems like your standard action RPG with some unique elements inspired by the original's turn-based origins. You have a pretty basic layout here. You've got a normal attack, a roll, a block, your menu button to access the menu to have access to all of your abilities, and then you have a special triangle move for each character. Your normal attacks are basically there to just do a little bit of damage. Primarily, they're there to build ATB. Now, the triangle attacks are really what make every character feel unique. They They also are low cost. They don't cost any resources to use, but they are specific extensions of a character's kit that are intended to build on their design some way. But one thing you'll notice very quickly is that the game is ordered around a very clear hierarchy on the amount of damage that certain moves do compared to others. Your basic attacks do the least damage, but are there to build ATB or do some other function. Your ATB abilities and spells do far more damage, but they consume resources. MP, by the way, does regenerate, although at a comically slow rate. It's 1 MP every 20 seconds or so. And since hard mode does not allow you to use items, you can't just refill your MP whenever you want, meaning you don't have to just manage your MP in an individual battle, but also throughout the whole span of a chapter. And then above that, you have your limit breaks, which are built by taking damage or dealing damage on a separate meter. They can have ridiculous damage output or effects, and they only consume limit meter, but they take much longer to charge. They can only really be used a sparing amount of times per battle, but all of these damage keyers are basically capped out in the amount of damage that you can do by the stagger system. And understanding what the stagger system is how you go from having your butt kicked in 7 Remake a lot to just absolutely dominating everything, even on the hardest difficulty. That even if you start a new save file with basically nothing, that you can still absolutely destroy everything in your path when you fully understand it. Every enemy in FF7R has a stagger bar. You fill it up by meeting certain conditions. You fill the orange bar below, and bada bing, bada boom, they're down for the count. They get knocked down, and you get to do a little extra damage to it while it's not moving. Now, this is a pretty neat system, but the more that you play the game, your perception about this mechanic starts to shift. When you're first playing through the game, you think, oh, wow, this is a pretty cool, extra feature. That's pretty cool. As I've played the game so much more and I've learned so much more, in my opinion, the stagger system is as fundamental to how combat function is as health bars. Let's take a perfect example. Chapter 1's boss, the Scorpion Sentinel. Cloud really emphasizes in the dialogue that you specifically need to hit it with lightning magic.
Lightning magic.
No other option, huh?
Didn't I tell you to use magic?
Thought you were full of shit.
Think whatever you want. Just do it.
And for a first-time playthrough, when you have almost no tools, yeah, the lightning magic is the only thing that's really effective against the Scorpion Sentinel. But when you go back and play that chapter, once you've obtained much more of your toolkit, you actually can achieve basically the same results without having to use lightning magic much, if at all. Why is that? Well, because the Scorpion Sentinel is weak to lightning magic and does take more damage from it, also massively builds up the stagger gauge. And this is basically how every enemy works. The conditions and thresholds as to what attacks will or won't add stagger to enemies will change from enemy to enemy or boss to boss. But the underlying foundation of adding stagger to an enemy is what ties the combat system together. There's even more, because it's not just enough that you put all that effort into staggering an enemy, because you also have a stagger multiplier, the percentage that pops up over them once they're knocked down. A normal stagger for an enemy or boss will have around 160% stagger damage multiplier, meaning that every attack you do does 1.6 times the damage. And that's a pretty significant boost. However, some bosses have a ton of health. In order to keep the flow of battle, you need to get that number up somehow. There are certain abilities in the game that allow you to increase that number higher and higher and allow you to do even more damage. And so learning how to increase that percentage, when to use attacks that will increase percentage, becomes a cornerstone to your gameplay once you get into hard mode and into the end game content. And there's one more mechanic that is a little bit subtle that actually ties the stagger system and the attack damage hierarchy together. Now, a lot of enemies will absolutely succumb to just getting hit with focus attacks straight on and just have the bar immediately fill. But a lot of enemies will not have the bar fill up very much, if at all. And that's where pressuring comes in. A system where if you just throw enough damage or a certain condition at an enemy, that they will actually be open to being more easily staggerable. Now, a lot of damage is extremely vague as to how it exactly works. It differs from enemy to enemy. There also seems to be a time component to it. Damage has to be within a short amount of time from each other, whether that be from a single powerful hit or multiple hits. For most enemies, just throwing a bunch of abilities at it or whatever elemental spell it's weak to will get you the pressure easily. Some enemies even have windows naturally built into their moveset where they just become pressured. To be honest, the pressuring system I am not super duper adept with, even after playing the game 4 times. A lot of the end game content, you try to pressure a boss and it takes literally everything you have, and then you still need a bunch of ATB to actually try to stagger them. Actually keeping track of what things will or won't pressure an enemy also is kind of a big deal, but it's a little hard to track just due to how many moves or what combination of moves will cause pressure on an enemy without just wasting your best resources is kind of a challenge and is hard to keep track of, to be honest. The only time I didn't feel like I had a problem keeping track of what was going to pressure or not was in intermission. But that's more of an accidental byproduct of having a much more limited toolset as Yuffie rather than an intentional design change. Yeah, in short, the key to almost every enemy in Remake is that you just hit enemies with enough attacks or the right spell to pressure them. Once they're pressured, you start hitting them with stagger building abilities, and then once they get staggered and they fall on the ground, then you just absolutely dump all of your ATB and resources into it, trying to increase the stagger percentage to get the damage multiplier up, and then other hard-hitting attacks to actually do damage. If you yourself want to learn these mechanics, I think fighting Fat Chocobo is a pretty great way to practice. You unlock his VR battle around Chapter 9 at the earliest, so you're already pretty familiar with every character's playstyle at this point. It's just as a bigger, slower boss, it gives you the space and time necessary to learn all of these mechanics initially and then build on top of it as you get better and better. You're pretty much going to destroy about 90 to 95% of the enemies in the game that way. Even doing just one of those steps I mentioned is probably going to destroy the vast majority of enemies in the game. All right, now that you know how to destroy basically the entire game, let's talk about the individual characters that you are going to channel that destructive force through. I really love the design philosophy the developers took when making the characters in the base game. Each one very clearly has a major strength and a major weakness that defines their playstyle. You can make those strengths even stronger or compensate for those weaknesses with various different materia, but in general, these are how the characters play. They usually have one major thing that their entire toolkit revolves around that they do better than any other character, but they're so well-rounded enough that they can be moved into different roles depending on the situation or the fight. Now notice I said all those sentences and said all these nice things specifically about the base game characters. Yuffie's a little bit different. We'll get into why her move kit is more like that later in the video. In addition, there are the character-specific abilities. As you go through the game and acquire new weapons, each one comes with a new ability that you can only use with that weapon. Once you use that ability enough that you can get a proficiency bonus that allows the ability to be used with any other weapon. This is one of my favorite things about 7 Remake and why I love its design so much. It is a nice way to get first-time players to try out each one of their new weapons and just generally experiment with their setups on regular occasion. But it's also nice that this ability acquisition process is built in such a way it caters to both someone who is learning how to use that move for the first time, but also makes it very quick for someone who has played through the game multiple times. For first-time players, getting that ability might not happen for an hour or a couple of hours. That learning curve might be a little bit more gradual. But also for repeat players, you could just spam the ability, get the proficiency bonus, and then take the weapon off and then use a preferred weapon instead.
How shocking!
Cloud is very much the all-rounder of the base game playable characters. His triangle move switches between his two combat stances, Operator and Punisher, to cover a wide variety of situations. Operator mode is a much more standard playstyle you would expect. You have fast attacks with Cloud's sword, and you can dodge roll. You have a basic block. Punisher mode focuses on longer strings of stronger attacks, and you gain a counter block, but you trade the ability to dodge. In fact, I would say that switching between the two stances is as important a feature as the individual stances themselves, because the actual switch mechanic gives you a counter window during the switch, so you can tank through enemy attacks and deal damage to them. He's the most complicated character to learn when you're first starting playing through the game, that it is a little overwhelming that you have these two different stances with two different purposes and you can switch between them. And I think the developers clearly knew that was the case. The game really loves throwing boss fights against solo Cloud at pretty regular intervals to not only teach, but also test your understanding of the two different stances. The first fight that you do with Roach in Chapter 4 is very much teaching you how to use these mechanics if you haven't picked up on already by this point. The second time when you're fighting Reno in Chapter 8, again against Rufus Shinra in Chapter 17, and the last time when you're fighting that first Sephiroth phase in Chapter 18. That is your final test. It says, do you understand what the point of Operator mode is and Punisher mode is? Because if you don't, you're not getting past this phase. I would say that the strongest aspect of Cloud, and really what defines his playstyle, is just his sheer physical damage output. Not counting limit breaks, just his normal abilities without any stagger multiplier increases. He can do some crazy amounts of damage. I mean, look at this up smash. Oh my goodness. It's pretty strong. Good for catching opponents crossing you up and killing off the top. And wait a minute. Talking about Smash Brothers, aren't I? Yeah, sometimes I get this game and 7 Remake mixed up. Even Punisher mode, being only a basic attack, actually can chip away a decent amount of HP. I've killed a couple bosses that were really close to defeat, but just had that little bit of sliver left by just doing a couple strings of basic attacks and then nothing else. I would say Cloud's biggest weakness is that his base kit feels a little bit more reactive rather than proactive. All the other characters have some sort of game plan to just build up doing more damage. Cloud is just really more there to provide interruptions to enemies. I think a good Cloud build can obviously use this to play into your favor, that Cloud's not just dumping ATB into something that's making him stronger, that you can just put materia on him that will cast buffs or serve some other function. Cloud's abilities, in my experience, just have this weird evergreen property to them. When I initially unlocked them and stuff, they were pretty useful, and then they managed to stay useful throughout all of my hundreds of hours of playthroughs, because that's not really the case for most of the other playable characters. At least 2 to maybe 3 of their specific abilities will generally drop off in usefulness the longer you play the game. A good third to half of your character-specific abilities that are not useful anymore. Bravery is the ability you start out with. A pretty good 1 ATB move. It's quick, it creates pressure a lot of the time on enemies, and does a good amount of damage. Next up is Triple Slash, the obvious crowd control tool. It does its job pretty well going between multiple targets, but I do find it a little bit janky when enemies are a bit too far apart, but it's mostly fine. It's also surprisingly decent against single targets that are moving as well. It also works surprisingly well when there's a gravity field, so even if an enemy is staggered and you're having a hard time hitting them, is not a bad option. Focus Thrust is the first in a series of focus abilities that multiple different characters have. Their intended primary purpose is to build a lot of stagger. Focus Thrust is arguably the worst of these since it has such a linear path that enemies often just jump out of the way before you're actually able to reach them. Interestingly, there's a benefit to using multiple of these in a row because Focus Thrust can combo into itself. The startup of the next Focus Thrust is much smaller than your initial one. Disorder is another option for switching between Operator and Punisher mode. Now, why you would use this instead of the free triangle switch is that it generally flows better into combat. It allows you to have your damage per second stay relatively high, even when you're switching between the two stances. It's also good for knocking enemies out of charging up to do a move. Disorder definitely does a lot to make Cloud's playstyle feel more action gamey rather than the hybrid system that the game actually is. Blade Burst is the most odd move in Cloud's kit. It's a triple beam move that does non-elemental magic damage. For most enemies, it's just another form of crowd control that's worse than triple slash. The range isn't particularly great, so it's not really that useful in larger arenas. And it just takes so long to start up. Can we talk about that damage category though? Non-elemental magic. I can't possibly think of an enemy in the entire game that specifically is weak to magic, but doesn't particularly care about what element it gets hit with. Infinity's End, the 2 ATB slower startup version of Braver. Infinity's End, on a first impression, maybe seems kind of bad. Why would you use a costlier, slower startup version of Braver, basically? But as I kept playing and I got better at staggering enemies and fully utilizing those windows, it actually became as good of an option as Braver, if not better. The damage output of Infinity's End versus how long it takes to do the move is definitely worth it, because you're going to be spending all of your ATB anyways on a staggered enemy. So if you have 2 ATB immediately available, doing an Infinity's End is better than doing 2 Bravers. And then we get to Cloud's last ability. Of course, they always save the game-breaking ones for last. It's another counter for Cloud, costing 1 ATB, but for that cost, this thing outperforms that cost. For most enemies and bosses, it's a no-brainer to use counter stance on them. It just does a ridiculous amount of damage. But then you have the opposite extreme, a much smaller set of enemies and bosses where counter stance doesn't do anything to them.
We've got to get through this. Can you handle them? Let's go!
Well, I think Cloud is the most complicated base game character. I actually think for the average player, Tifa is the hardest to wrap your head around conceptually. Tifa's moveset is much easier and faster to learn than Cloud's, but the actual purpose of her moveset, I think, evades a lot of people. But unlike Cloud, there's no real point in the game, I feel, where the game skill checks you for your ability to stagger or build stagger percentage. I say this from personal experience. I didn't really get what Tifa was about until probably a couple chapters into my hard mode playthrough. Tifa's strength is her ability to build stagger and stagger percentage and capitalize on doing so with her speed. While Tifa herself doesn't do the most damage, she can definitely set up stagger percentages for her and the rest of the party to deal a lot. In addition, her overall speed is just really helpful. Being able to reposition yourself very quickly to another part of a boss and taking down that part to start building stagger is very helpful in the stagger building process. I say Tifa's weakness is probably just how long it takes to set her up somewhat optimally. Tifa without any self buffs is kind of a below average character, so you have to spend at least 2 ATB to self buff her there. Plus you want to have another 2 ATB on standby. If a boss does get staggered, you have follow-ups ready to go from the jump. FF7 Remake can be pretty fast-paced, and you can fill the stagger meter pretty quickly if you are aggressive enough. So sometimes you have to play a little bit less aggressively on purpose if you don't hit all the exact right switches and levers to get Tifa ready to go with a rise and fall in 2 ATB right when an enemy gets staggered. Tifa's triangle attack is heavily tied into one of her starting abilities, Unbridled Strength. And trying to explain that without explaining the ability, it just wouldn't make any sense. You spend an ATB bar to buff your normal attacks so they deal more stagger and more damage. And you can do this twice before reaching the limit. This buff not only changes and extends your normal combo, it also changes the attack that the triangle move does. The first one where you don't have any buff is Whirling Uppercut, a pretty simple attack that adds very little stagger percentage. Omni Strike is the level 2 version. That's a set of punches that adds a moderate stagger percentage. And the final one is Rise and Fall, a series of kicks finishing with a punch that does a high amount of stagger percentage. Now, all of these attacks kind of stack, since when you use Rise and Fall, you're not immediately using all your charge and going back to Whirling Uppercut. You're actually going down to Omni Strike. Also, pro tip, if you want to do the uppercut attack, but you don't want to expend any of your charges, you can also just hold the basic attack back button to use it. I've got nothing more to say about Unbridled Strength except that if you combine it with a specific materia, it's one of the most interesting and powerful combos in the game. Dive Kick is a 1 ATB kick that acts as kind of a finisher for Tifa's move string. After doing a whirling uppercut, you do a dive kick, and it flows very seamlessly. Overpower is fine. A quick 1 ATB move that does a little spinny attack that does a fair bit of damage. I find it particularly useful for breaking certain enemy parts and killing smaller enemies. Although the game itself claims that Overpower is good for building pressure specifically, I'm not entirely sure it really does it all that much better than the rest of Tifa's kit. Chain Trap is an ability that I really want to like, but I personally don't find super useful. It's a 1 ATB stationary orb that builds Stagger. It doesn't add percentage, it just fills the meter. But since it's stationary, it only really has this niche use case of being usable on enemies that are not moving and are pressured. I don't know why you would use this specifically when there's so many other focus building abilities that are better. Speaking of which, Focus Strike is a 1 ATB kick that's supposed to add a lot of Stagger. It's actually one of the few moves in the game that gives you invincibility frames. The only real complaint I have with the move is that the windup itself is a little bit annoying, that certain bosses will just get up if you're not constantly hitting them. And you can actually kind of do 2 of them in quick succession. After you do the first Focus Strike and you parry dodge out of the way, you can do another one pretty quickly afterwards, which is much better than the actual self-chaining if you do 2 in a row without that parry in the middle. Star Shower is pretty cool. It's another move that gives you invincibility frames, and it boosts the power of your next ability, including your triangle attack. I think the idea behind it is that you're supposed to build pressure with it, and then your next immediate action is going to be immediately strengthened. But I don't know why you would use this over using 2 of the same 1 ATB ability in a row, especially for this next ability, because, oh boy. Oh yeah, True Strike. This move is absolutely disgusting, and it's another ability that they give you right at the end of the game. Funny how that works. You spend a single ATB to add a whopping 30% stagger each time you use the move. Now, adding 30% stagger is already pretty substantial when enemies already start at 160% damage. So you're getting close to double. If you continually keep using your ATB to True Strike, you can keep this percentage going up and up and up, further and further and further. As long as you have the ATB and the enemy is still staggered, you can push this percentage really high. One of the PlayStation trophies on this game is called Staggering Feat, with the requirement of deal 300% damage to a staggered enemy. This is how you get to that ludicrous number. In fact, I've done a couple runs against Fat Chocobo specifically, where I got to 400% with Tifa alone, just repeatedly True Striking over and over and over again. I cannot understate how much True Strike absolutely warps how every combat encounter goes in this game once you figure it out. Once you get this down, bosses will just melt in front of your eyes. What's even more crazy is that the move itself can actually deal pretty good damage once you get into those higher stagger percentages, allowing you to kill bosses even faster. And there's not really any reason to not use this strategy. There's no counterplay since you're doing it on a staggered enemy which can't respond to you. Understanding True Strike's purpose and optimizing your playstyle to include it is such an incredibly fun payoff to learning about the entire game's combat system. It is really fun to just hit enemies really hard with True Strike and just see their HP go away.
Now for Chase.
I've got this. Keep it up.
I'll take care of this like hard and fast.
Barret, some might say, is the most boring character to play in 7 Remake. I mean, why would you find this slow, lumbering character with slow attacks and not super engaging gameplay interesting at all? The main game has a 3 party member party for a reason. Not every single character needs to be zipping around really fast. And no matter what team combination you choose, that slower party member is going to be there, whether it's Aerith or Barret. The thing that makes Barret stand out compared to every other character is that depending on the weapon he's using, it can entirely change his basic attack playstyle altogether. One being ranged and the other being close combat. The primary playstyle is the gun arms. Just hold square and he'll keep shooting at whatever he's targeting until you have a little pop as a break in the attack, and then he'll keep going. In my experience, I find the attack actually tracks pretty well, both for grounded and aerial enemies, and Barret's pretty good about repositioning himself. So you're not really gonna miss with this attack ever. His triangle ability is Overcharge. It's an attack that does a fair bit of damage and gains at least 1 ATB gauge on average. However, it needs to recharge once used. Now, this charge can rebuild over time, naturally, or you can press triangle to manually recharge. But doing that on its own is just really slow when you could just continue to keep shooting. The actual intended and much faster way to do a recharge is after you shoot out a bunch of bullets with your gun arm. During the little pop afterwards, you hit triangle to reload during a time that you're not attacking anyways, and it's much faster. But did you know that you can also build up charge outside of following up basic attacks? For my testing, any ability that does damage, you can reload right after, aside from Overcharge itself. I feel like an absolute idiot for not knowing this any ability recharge follow-up thing until 150 hours into playing this game, so I just wanted to share this. Now, the melee arms for Barret are an entirely different story. Melee Barret is one of the most fascinating 7 Remake characters because it is the most unorthodox playstyle in the whole game. It takes the whole tank aspect and makes it much more literal, as you are encouraged to run into enemies. You do this 3-hit combo that has super armor on it, so you don't get knocked back while taking damage. And while his Overcharge move has that same underlying mechanic of being a meter that consistently fills, it now serves as a charge attack that has armor on it and does a pretty powerful slam at the end. And he has the beefiest block in the game, although he can't move during it like the rest of the characters. I will say, well, I do like Barret's gun arm playstyle, even if it is very simplistic. I don't like the melee one as much, although I can't exactly put a finger on why. I'm not even just talking about it in terms of raw damage numbers or anything. I mean, just in terms of just like moment-to-moment fun. Just doing basic attacks just doesn't feel as exciting as all the other characters in Barret's gun arm playstyle. That even though I've spent hundreds of hours doing Cloud's attacks, he still feels really fun to play just using his basic attacks. But for Barret's melee arm, I can't. Barret's strength is just being a consistently reliable character. His gun arm is the most consistent way to acquire ATB for any basic attack in the game, since it can hit enemies from pretty far away. His high HP stat and good defensive abilities means that he is the hardest party member to outright kill. Barret's weakness is a big one though, and ties into overall team composition, and it makes it kind of hard for me to recommend using him all the time. Barret just kinda sucks at dealing damage with any of his own abilities. Yeah, his Overcharge does do a decent amount of damage on normal enemies and can make them flinch sometimes, but bosses are just absolutely unaffected by either of those, and so it just becomes a free ATB bar. Barret can do decent damage with magic when equipped with the right materia, but that costs MP and is a very valuable resource. But the main reason I think as to why it is this way, just making his damage output lower, was splitting the difference between his two different styles of gameplay and balancing for both. In a normal way that you would balance these two play styles in most other games, that would mean that Barret would be radically changing character attributes just based on what thing he puts on his arm. Imagine playing melee Barret with a high HP stat, and then you put on a gun arm, and then his HP gets cut in half. The only way to balance Barret without him feeling entirely different between using the two weapons is to just make his damage output suck. Steel Skin is a 1 ATB self-buff, protecting Barret from being flinched by more minor enemies and boosting his defense a little bit. It's not by any means absolutely necessary for every fight, but I try to put it on when I have the spare ATB. I do think though that Steel Skin is one of the few failings of 7 Remake's visual readability. For as crazy as the game gets with particle effects, it somehow manages to still be extremely visually readable. I can't explain why though. Since Steel Skin is indicated with a minor visual effect like that, in a game that has a lot of particle effects, that it can expire and you might not even realize it because the visual indicator is that subtle. Lifesaver is a 1 ATB passive ability where Barret can take life-saving hits for other party members. It definitely takes advantage of Barret's high HP stat and does help out the rest of the team. Although the flip side to this is that while the other characters will still live, Barret will get reduced down to 1 HP sometimes, meaning that a slight gust of wind can very easily kill him. I think that kind of defeats the point of using Barret a little bit sometimes. I don't really understand the point of charging Uppercut. You spend an ATB bar to go in, hit an enemy, and get charge for Barret's overcharge. It's definitely one of those abilities that's meant to be used on normal enemies since it does basically nothing on bosses. So, okay, so you're spending an ATB bar to fill a meter faster. That's whole point is a free ATB bar. I think that 1 ATB could be better spent. Another cool, unique thing about Barret is that some of his abilities have no fixed ATB cost. Whatever ATB bars that you have accumulated, it'll spend all of them. This gives you a fair amount of flexibility as to how strong you want that specific ability, but also it allows you to do some really cool tricks I'll be talking about later on in the video. Focus Shot is the best of the focus attacks in the game, since not only can it be fired from across the battle arena and tracks enemies pretty decently, you can also dump 2 ATB in it to add even more stagger. The 1 ATB version is pretty decent, but I always try to use the 2 ATB version whenever I can. Maximum Fury is an attack intended to interrupt enemies, but I found its usability to entirely vary based on how much ATB you put into it. The 1 ATB version I found to feel pretty limp, but the 2 ATB version is actually pretty good, and it's your best damage dealing tool in your stock kit. The next 2 abilities come from Barret's melee weapons, and are by far his worst abilities. I'm not really a huge fan of them, because even though they're clearly meant to be forms of crowd control, they don't feel super effective forms of them, and in boss fights they're basically useless. Smackdown isn't really about dealing damage, but more about getting clumps of enemies off of you. Since hordes of enemies can be somewhat overwhelming in this game, being able to shrug off some attacks and get enemies further apart from each other is actually kind of nice, even if its usefulness is very niche. Point Blank, another move that scales with ATB, and it's a close range attack that leaves a blast charge on an enemy and detonates after a few seconds. It's pretty cool to use on smaller enemies. Again, not useful on bosses. I really adore Aerith's playstyle. She's kind of likes hanging out in the back away from everything else, having more passive abilities, attacking enemies from afar, and building ATB to unleash some really strong magic. Aerospace's attacks only really exist to build ATB and not to deal a little bit of damage like the other basic attacks on the other characters. You release these little bubbles that do damage based on your magic stat. Aerith's Triangle move Tempest is a charge-up move that can hit an enemy and has a little bit of a lingering effect. But the optimal way to do it is at the end of a basic attack string that you do it, and it has a much stronger lingering effect. It's most effective against staggered enemies where it builds up way more ATB. It's pretty obvious what Aerith's strengths are just based on her character design. It's her really powerful magic stat combined with her insane supportive abilities. I think it's pretty in character for Aerith that some of the abilities that she has don't just exclusively benefit her, but also all of the other party members can take advantage of it sometimes as well. I say that Aerith's primary weakness is her overall fragility in combat. She's by far the most fragile playable character and will probably be the first to die in any given battle. Even with a single HP up materia, she still has a surprisingly low HP stat. She's one of the slower moving characters around a battle arena, and she doesn't even have a dodge roll. She just has this sidestep, I guess you'd call it. And while I do find this dodge awkward, I have gotten out of some pretty gnarly situations using it, so it can't be all that bad. But the primary way you're gonna have her not get hit is to just be proactive, switching ways to draw attention away from her, stop enemies from targeting her specifically. Soul Drain, your starting ability, is pretty much how you're able to use Aerith at all in hard mode when you can't use any items to refill your MP. It's a 1 ATB projectile, and on non-staggered enemies, it takes a pretty pathetic 4 MP. However, on staggered enemies specifically, this ability gets way better, stealing up to 20 MP and dealing a decent bit of damage as well. Now, 20 MP is a lot, but also not a lot. A lot of the higher tier versions of spells will cost more than 20 MP, but remember, you can cast multiple drains on an enemy and get more MP back. Now, this ability in VR battles doesn't have as much use, considering that between rounds you're getting your MP and HP refilled. Arcane Ward is one of the most absurd abilities in the entire game, and its interactions with certain materia just push it over the edge into just being absolutely crazy. It's a 1 ATB casting circle that stays in place wherever you cast it. Any character, not just Aerith, can go inside that ward, cast an elemental spell, and then upon completing that spell, they will cast another one for no ATB cost and a reduced MP cost. The highest tier versions of elemental spells already do a ton of damage, so having a second one immediately follow up is incredibly brutal. And with how incentivized you are to switch characters constantly, having one party member just sit in the ward and cast spells and nothing else isn't that big of a deal. You can even have multiple characters in the ward and cast multiple spells at the same time. Yeah, pretty much anything that's weak to magic or has a specific elemental weakness is pretty much screwed once you get this set up. But for as absurdly powerful as Arcane Ward is, it's not open season on enemies that you could just sit inside this circle and spam magic. There are limitations, and the game does have some counterplay to prevent that behavior, albeit not a ton. The major limitation of Arcane Ward is that you're not actually casting the same spell twice. Like, okay, you're casting the same named spell twice in a row, and it takes just as long to actually charge up to cast it. But the second one is halved in power. It is still pretty good, though, because while you're dealing half the amount of damage, you're doing it at a quarter of the MP cost of the original spell. And there's still the normal drawbacks that come with magic. It still takes just as long to cast these spells, but now you're doing multiple of them in a row. And casting that second spell still costs MP. It's a heavily reduced cost, but it still costs MP. And if you're not Aerith, draining the vast majority of your MP when it's hard to regain is probably not the smartest choice when you could be saving your MP for something else. And lastly, a weird thing to consider: enemy movement. You have to be particularly careful about where you place it. The AI just loves to move around and stuff all willy-nilly. But despite all of that, Arcane Ward is still incredibly strong with no real major drawbacks or downsides. Ray of Judgment, I think, is an interesting ability, but it's probably Aerith's worst offensive ability. Costing 2 ATB, this ability is just a laser that adds stagger to an enemy. If an enemy is staggered already, it does actually add like 20 to 30% to an enemy, so that's pretty cool. It's definitely an interesting idea to give Aerith an ability that's similar to something you'd find on Tifa, but there's just so many drawbacks to it that it's not even worth using. It costs 2 ATB. It takes forever to start up. Doesn't track, meaning the direction you shoot it in is going to be the direction it's in the entire time. And only shooting one direction is going to extremely limit its usefulness for non-staggered enemies. Lustrous Shield. It's a shield that protects from magic and physical attacks in the direction that you cast it in. What else can I really say? I feel like this ability is pretty pointless because, again, enemies just love to move around a lot. Unless you're absolutely sure that you know where a big attack is going to hit you, there's no point in using this. Sorcerer's Storm, the 1 ATB lightning move that I guess is technically a form of crowd control. I tend to think of it more as a get off of me type move, as a way to significantly damage or kill smaller enemies that are really close to Aerith. Those fake Tonberries and bombs in the Fat Chocobo VR battle are the primary reason why I use this move semi-regularly. Fleeting Familiar is another self buff, a 1 ATB move that gives you a little butterfly that hangs around Aerith. It gives more damage and stagger to all of your attacks. But the coolest thing about it is that it inflicts damage and stagger even while you're casting a spell. So while you're waiting for that spell to charge up, it goes out. And Aerith's final ability, ATB Ward, on paper is even crazier than Arcane Ward. Any non-Aerith character in the ward casting abilities will get a little bit of ATB back. Now, with proper spacing regarding a staggered enemy and additional materia that boosts ATB on certain conditions, you could easily have an ever-flowing fountain of ATB for almost any character. Like Arcane Ward has the same downside of being stationary, but the other drawback, Aerith herself does not gain any ATB from being in the ward. In fact, if another party member uses an ability in the ward, it drains ATB from Aerith if she has any. It's definitely an interesting trade-off, if I could say so. Although, there's a certain materia that basically makes this trade-off null and void altogether.
Too bright? Pour on the paint!
Enough.
Yuffie is definitely the most complex character in 7 Remake overall. She definitely needed those additional mechanics, considering that you're only playing as her throughout the entire 2 chapters. Her gimmick is the throw mechanic. She throws her shuriken, and you can do a couple different things with it. You can repeatedly press square to do this multi-hitting action on the enemy that it's targeted, called ninjutsu. You can also press triangle again to go retrieve your shuriken, and Yuffie, if close enough, will go in to retrieve it herself. Or hold the square button, have your shuriken come back to you, and do a big shockwave attack. The weirdest thing about Yuffie's kit is that she has a perfect block mechanic that gives you a minor buff if you block at the exact right time. The kind of buff depends on the weapon you're using. It makes her gameplay much more comparable to Cloud's, where you have to think about both the offensive aspect and the defensive aspect. To be honest, Yuffie is like the last character I would have expected with a perfect block mechanic in an actionified Final Fantasy VII Remake. I would say Yuffie's big strength is that she's really good at exploiting enemy weaknesses. Enemies that are weak to certain elements or are easily pressured by attacks in rapid succession, she's got the tools for it and has that on lockdown. She has such a wide variety of tools that's really good at getting the process of a stagger going. Outside of hitting enemy elemental weaknesses, her damage output is just kind of underwhelming. For that first stretch of Chapter 1 when it's just her, this isn't a problem at all, but when you're paired up with Sonon in the later stages of Chapter 2, this drawback and flaw really starts to show itself. I actually found Yuffie's abilities kind of hard to assess and analyze because intermission is just so short. I've played it so many times and I've fought in so many VR battles, but the game just doesn't really give you that much to really chew on in terms of different battle scenarios to where all of her abilities could be actually demonstrated as useful or not. Arvor is a pretty good 1 ECB move that's quick, has pretty good surrounding reach, and can chain into itself. Works pretty well both for solo targets and as a form of crowd control. And you can tell that Arvor's intended to be chained into itself because Yuffie has specific lines that finish when you use 2 of them in a row. Windstorm is pretty decent, a 1 ATB wind element move that sucks in enemies as a form of crowd control and also leaves a little bit of a lingering effect afterwards. I personally never found this ability super useful.
Elemental Ninjutsu is one of the more creative abilities in the game, and definitely feels like a fun way to augment Yuffie's playstyle. You spend 1 ATB and choose a specific element to then enchant on your shuriken, and now you can have elemental damage on your weapon during normal attacks. It's kind of like the elemental materia slotted onto a weapon, but it's built into Yuffie's base kit. Now, an interesting quirk about this ability is that given enough shuriken spamming, you'll get a hit effect from your shuriken that acts like a mini version of the element spell that it's based on. So on certain hits, you'll get a little lightning blast or little ice crystals. I feel like all of the elements that Yuffie has access to are useful to some degree in intermission. The enemy weakness spread between the main campaign and VR bosses feels even enough that you're having to switch between elements on a semi-regular basis. Banement's another really creative ability within the ATB system. It becomes more powerful the more ATB moves you do, and it also gains the element of whenever ninjutsu you have casted on your shuriken. I find the level 1 version to be very underwhelming, and the level 2 one is okay if you need to use it there and then to get a pressure and stagger off of an enemy. But personally, I'd be patient and wait to use the level 3 banishment, which has the absolute best payoff with the highest elemental damage. The only real downside of banishment, in my opinion, is that even for a level 2 version, it takes a while to charge, so it's not really that useful for a lot of the smaller enemy fights. By the time you get a level 2, a lot of those enemies are going to be dead. Brutal Form is one of the most insane abilities in the entire game. For very little ATB cost, you can do a completely invincible dodge. And if an enemy hits you during that dodge window, you actually gain the ATB you spent on that back, meaning that you can repeatedly do brutal forms in quick succession if an enemy is doing a rapid series of attacks. It's also a very convenient way to cancel out of moves that you're doing. Cactuar Caper is the worst ability in the game, bar none. Now, I will admit I may have a personal bias against Cactuar Caper as an ability because the weapon it's attached to, the Cackstar, was a pre-order bonus for Intergrade on PS5, and Square Enix later sold it as $10 DLC on the PS5 version. And I bought that DLC. For 1 ATB, you get your Ninja Star to move around in a way that looks like a Cactuar running, especially the actual Cackstar weapon itself. I think it's supposed to be a crowd control move, but it's pretty much Yuffie's worst crowd control option, which already has Art of War and Windstorm, and it's basically useless on bosses. And that about wraps it up for Yuffie. Wait a minute. I feel like I'm forgetting something. Something that's a little bit important to her kit. Okay, so the reason why I haven't brought up aerial combat so far is because, well, it just sucks. For Cloud and Tifa in the base game, it is legitimately a terrible experience that I do not wish on anybody. There's a lot of reasons why this sucks. Firstly, there's no dedicated jump button in Remake. You have this bizarre auto-tracking system where the enemy has to be a certain level off the ground before the game can initiate your jump attacks. But this doesn't always work correctly. There's a lot of situations where an enemy is high enough off the ground to where most of your attacks will not hit, like 75 to 90%. But the enemy is not high enough off the ground for the game to give you the jump attack. And I absolutely have zero quantifiable evidence of this, but I swear the developers tweaked the jump a bit in Intergrade compared to the base PS4 version. I feel like in a lot of situations in the PS4 version, there are enemies that just I would not get the jump trigger for, but then playing a similar situation in Intergrade where an enemy's at the same height, that Intergrade would give me the jump just a little bit more often. Secondly, air combat is just inherently shallow. You get a basic 3-hit aerial combo for Cloud, and then you get a string of attacks for Tifa based on how many unbridled strength charges you have. And that's it for all of your aerial attacks. I am not joking. You can't use any of your abilities, you can't use any material, you can't use any of your character gimmicks whatsoever. Now, most of the time you do have a party member with you, like Aerith or Barret, where they're basic attacks and hit aerial enemies. So I would say most aerial enemy fights are not extremely painful. But upon my third playthrough of the game, I finally noticed how many times you don't have either of these characters where you do have to fight aerial enemies. One of the side quests in Chapter 3, the one you have to go into the old factory and you have to fight a Drake, it's just Cloud and Tifa, and it is a painful experience, especially when you don't have all of your materia leveled up. Or how in the Corneo Coliseum battles to get everyone's level 2 limit breaks, you have to use one party member against waves and waves of enemies. And then the last round, you have to fight a Drake. So in order for Cloud and Tifa to obtain their most powerful moves in the game, you actively have to engage in the worst aspect of the game's combat. Square Enix, you gotta be trolling people, right? Now, I will say, Yuffie's aerial combat is a noticeable improvement. However, it still isn't particularly great either. There's still no dedicated jump button for Yuffie, even though shuriken retrieval kind of acts like one. Even that as a makeshift jump still has weird problems with it. I tended to notice a lot of the time that if you were far enough away from the enemy, that the shuriken would just come back to you rather than taking you to the enemy. Now, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. Y'all obviously gotta balance an ability like that somehow. But there's no indicator by the game if you're within range so that way you can get to an enemy. So you're not really gonna know if you're within range of an enemy or not until you hit the button. But the major difference, I'd say, is that Yuffie can use some of her abilities in the air, with Brumal Form being the most prevalent, so it's the only way to dodge in the air. But even with all the Yuffie-specific improvements, aerial combat is still extremely and deeply flawed the way it currently exists in the game. There's just no meaningful enemy engagement in the air. It really only just exists so you can slap them around a bit, get ATB, so that way when you get back to the ground, you can actually cast something useful. But it's a small enough role in the game overall that it's not going to ruin the entire game. He has weapon abilities that he can earn through the use of his weapons and a limit break. However, he's not controllable by the player at all. He's only controlled through the AI, and that's really bad. Sonon is the absolute worst party member in the entire game. There's no questions. I'm not going to debate this. He is, in fact, the absolute worst. If the main 7 Remake cast of playable characters is an A- in terms of character design, and Yuffie is an A+, Sonon is like a D- or F. He is that bad. So let's talk about this game's teammate AI and why Sonon specifically is really bad. Now, if you've played 7 Remake as extensively as I have, you'll know that the teammate AI is not particularly great. They just do basic attacks, and then any material that have behavior attached to them, they will do. But other than that, they're not really that aggressive. Now, on a first playthrough on normal difficulty, you can kind of notice the passiveness of your teammates, but it's not really a problem that much, since enemies aren't really that aggressive and don't push players to use all of their options. But it becomes much more of a liability in hard mode, as enemies get more aggressive. When you're having to deal and do much more to fight enemies, that passive teammates really doesn't seem to cut it as much. Now, this might be a hot take, but in my opinion, the way that the game is designed, that I don't think that the passive teammates, even in hard mode, is really that much of an issue. In the base game, it's very clearly intended that when you're playing hard mode, that you're supposed to be constantly swapping between characters, to be constantly filling up ATB. And so the teammate AI is at least sufficient enough to keep doing basic attacks to charge some ATB and guard while you're cycling through the other party members until you get back to them. And you, the viewer, have been watching my gameplay throughout this entire video. You can see how much I am absolutely destroying almost everything in the game. I will admit, though, that this gameplay took a pretty big learning curve over many dozens of hours for me to actually properly get when to switch and when not. Although I will admit, though, the AI can be pretty clutch at dodging sometimes. Now, would I like the teammate AI to be better? Absolutely. But I think that kind of depends on what your definition of better is. I think actually a behavior toggle, kind of like the Kingdom Hearts party members, would actually be extremely helpful. For example, for Barret, if I could set his behavior to use triangle attacks while I'm not controlling him, would actually be very helpful. Because I find a lot of the time I have to actively babysit him to just press the triangle button when he has his charge. But then for other characters like Tifa, I don't want her to use her triangle attacks all willy-nilly. melee. I put a bunch of resources and effort into getting that unbridled strength charge, so I would prefer to have her behave in the way that she does now in the game. For me, the character I would want a behavioral toggle for the most is Aerith. Her AI behavior is just really, really annoying because every character generally goes towards an enemy that's targeted. But Aerith has abilities that are specifically dependent on being stationary within one spot. So you cannot trust the AI Aerith to just not leave the arcane ward while they're casting a spell or something. You have to manually take control of her or deliberately set up her wards in such a way so that way she does not move no matter what you do while she is not under your control. But that second one is a problem because enemies just love to move around in this game. So really option one is your only option. But that brings me back to Sonon. You can see where the problems start, right? Since you cannot directly control Sonon, he becomes much more of a liability rather than an asset. So not only does he come with the drawbacks of your average 7 Remake AI controlled teammate, he also for some reason is way worse at dodging than every other AI teammate in the game. It took until, I'm not even kidding, my 4th playthrough of Intermission to realize why Sonon is so bad at dodging. When you synergize with Sonon, he'll warp over to you, but not immediately. It'll take him like a second or two. And when I was fighting the Pride and Joy Mark 0.5 boss, I'd always have Sonon just grabbed immediately at the start of the battle no matter what would happen. So often I would just have to solo it for a large portion of the fight. That was until doing a specific run, I realized that just using the synchronize button got him away from that initial grab. So this is the intended way, I think, to make sure Sonon doesn't die if he's standing in front of an easily telegraphed large attack. So we have a game with no jump button, but we have a dedicated teleport button. Base Sonon without any materia attached to him straight up sucks for no reason. I think has a survivability rating just slightly above Aerith. I don't know why the developers just let Sonon slide at all. This game has a lot of smart character design decisions, and yet he does not really play to the game's strengths at all. By being an AI-only party member and having so much of your toolkit just wrapped up in just him existing creates a very frustrating gameplay experience. In the best cases, Sonon is only okay, and at the worst, he is terrible, which is much less than I can say for the base game's AI. I guess all of this does make sense, though, because Sonon is such a jobber that he even dies in the story.
Hey, what's in here? Sonon?
Arguably, the only good thing about Sonon is that when Yuffie falls in battle, Sonon will sacrifice himself to revive her. And this is not even a once per battle thing either. As long as Sonon is alive when Yuffie dies, he will always kill himself to save her. However, you can't just play as Yuffie and ignore Sonon entirely as much as I would wish you could. Because some of her most powerful tools in Intermission are locked behind keeping Sonon alive. Which brings me to Synergizing. It's a very cool mechanic where the single press of a button will synergize and start attacking together. This mechanic is pretty special, not just in the usefulness in gameplay, but it also looks really cool from an aesthetic standpoint. Having animations for Yuffie and Sonon that show off the individual ways that they specifically attack, yet work together despite the way they attack being different, is just a really cool detail to see. Now, there's a couple different ways to do normal attacks, and they're all set up very similarly to how Yuffie does her normal attacks. There's close range attacks, and then Yuffie can throw her shuriken and just shuriken spam, and Sonon will help her with that. But there's one normal attack that is so incredibly strong that once you figure out it's a thing, combat is basically solved in Intermission. This bouncing attack, done by mashing square while synergized, can build stagger meter extremely quickly, about as fast as you can mash the button. But since it's a normal attack, you're not spending ATB on it to build stagger like all of the other stagger building abilities in the game. Now, I think for the Chapter 2 bosses and the VR battles, I think it's a little over-aggressive. on how much stagger it gives you, but for the normal enemies, it just totally obliterates them, and the game really has no counterplay against this strategy. I presume because intermission is so short, by the time that 99% of players figure out that this mechanic is a thing, the experience is going to be over. Oh well. I'd actually argue that synergizing is a bit too good despite its on-paper drawbacks. The first drawback is setup time. It does actually take a little bit of time for you to actually get that bouncing attack going, so you could be interrupted by an enemy and you have to properly position yourself and time yourself, etc., etc. And secondly is just the overall balancing mechanism of synergizing. When you flip it on, you trade off your ATB charging speed. Even with a haste cast, it is noticeably slower to charge ATB in this state. In fact, this trade-off is so specifically well-tuned that when you're doing this bouncing attack, you will not be charging ATB even with a haste. Synergization is why Yuffie's kit is so bizarrely lopsided. Instead of having major aspects of the combat system that the 4 playable characters each excel at in different ways, you have Yuffie with most of the moves that are really good at exploiting weaknesses, but generally don't deal that much damage. While Synergizing contains the more generic moves of combat, irrespective of an enemy's specific elemental weakness, your pressure building moves, your stagger building moves, your stagger percentage building moves. And it's not just normal attacks either. You can also do certain team versions of Yuffie abilities. And the team version will even appear in your little shortcut menu instead of the normal Yuffie ones. But it spends equivalent ATB bars for both characters. So if you don't have enough ATB for Sonon, it'll just default to the Yuffie solo versions instead. There's even a synergized limit break the two can do together with a specific Sonon weapon upgrade. Now, for the actual synergized abilities themselves, they are pretty fun to use, I will admit. Synergized Art of War, it's a 2 ATB, really strong hit attack. Just raw damage. And is the strongest ability that is not an element. It's also the strongest and most consistent way to pressure enemies. I've seen it work 99% of the time. I have to commend the animation team once again because this move just absolutely sells the power of it. This ability combined with the bouncing attack basically solves intermission combat. You just wait for an opening on an enemy, you hit them with the synergized Art of War, they'll be pressured, and then you can start doing that bouncing move and build up stagger really, really quickly until they're staggered. Synergized Windstorm is how you're able to kill bosses with any amount of speed in intermission since it increases stagger percentage. It is interesting how after the main hit, there's this lingering effect that Synergized Windstorm has where it can potentially add more percentage than True Strike even, but if you activate another ability immediately after, it'll fizzle out, which I guess is a fair way to balance it. I guess it's just throwing me off because I'm so used to True Striking a bunch of times in a row with Tifa. And there's one last synergized ability I want to talk about, but it's entirely unique from the rest, as you actually have to put in a materia on one of your characters in order to be able to use it. Ninja Cannonball is a slottable special attack that Yuffie and Sonon can do together while synergized that charges Sonon's ATB gauge specifically. It is the only way you can have Sonon gain ATB on the player's terms rather than have the AI do its own thing. I find it's a genuinely well-balanced move. It gives Sonon ATB, but it has a slow enough startup that it's not super abusable, that you can just use it to just constantly keep Sonon at 2 ATB all the time. My preferred way of using it is at the end of an enemy or a boss stagger. As they're getting back up, I just go in for a quick Ninja Cannonball just to have something ready to go.
That's a good word to describe me.
Oh yeah, there's also Sonon's abilities. Yay. They're all extremely underwhelming and don't have any depth due to being on an AI exclusive character. So I don't really have that much to say about them, so I'll be going over them very quickly. Twirling Lunge is a 1 ATB move that deals stagger. Swirling Storm is a generic 1 ATB attack move that only really exists to break Yuffie out from a boss grabbing her, which surprisingly happens a lot in intermission. Fighting Spirit is a 1 ATB power buff where Sonon focuses more on a single enemy. And Insight draws enemies' attention away from Yuffie as a form of crowd control. And last, but certainly least in terms of overall gameplay impact for characters, I didn't forget to mention the other AI party member in this game, Red 13. Red 13 is actually pretty simple for an AI party member. Unlike Sonon, none of Red 13's battle mechanics are transparent to the player. He doesn't show up in the menu, you can't equip him with anything, and you can't even give him commands to do specific attacks. He has some basic attacks and a healing move, and a pretty cool limit break with Stardust Ray. In the 2 chapters he's in, I didn't really feel like he made much of an impression. He did have the occasional heal, which was nice, but it didn't feel like his presence shifted the balance of combat to where if he wasn't there, I would miss him. Pretty much none of my criticisms of Sonon apply to Red 13, since he doesn't tie into the rest of the combat system. The fact that he is just there and detached from whatever you're doing is the best thing about him. And that leaves the most powerful moves in all of 7 Remake for last, the limit breaks. There's the level 1 versions that every character starts out with, and then there's the unlockable level 2 versions that do significantly more stagger and damage or have stronger effects, but take up way more limit bars than the level 1s. There's not really much to say about the individual limit breaks themselves that differentiate them from each other. Cross Slash, Fire in the Hole, Bloodbath, Dance of the Dragon, and Somersault all deal a good amount of damage. And Ascension, Catastrophe, Limit Sync, and Dolphin Flurry are way stronger and can be complete blowouts on a staggered enemy, but they also have much more startup compared to the level 1s. The only ones really different from the rest are Aerith's limits, Healing Wind and Planet's Protection. Healing Wind, which gives you a heal comparable to a maxed out Prey materia, obviously with the upside that it doesn't use 2 ATB. And Planet's Protection, giving your party physical damage immunity for around 80 seconds. I'd say that Aerith's limits are the worst limits in the game, not because they're supportive in nature compared to all the damage-dealing ones, rather because they're just kind of underwhelming. And I kind of view that as part of balancing Aerith's character. She's already crazy strong at magic and can cast wards that any party member can use. Do you really want her to have strong limit breaks on top of that? But it'd be weird if Aerith was the only character that didn't have limit breaks, so they obviously had to give her something. Limit breaks are very clearly designed to be finishers on staggered bosses. You get their stagger percentage up, you hit them with a limit break, and they are dead. But counterintuitive to what they're clearly designed for, they also can be very helpful in getting a stagger going. And then there's one more limit break in the game that's supportive in nature and is really, really cool, Refocus. You actually don't acquire it like the rest of the limit breaks in the game. You have to slot it in via materia. Refocus upon activation takes your maximum ATB gauge from 2 to 3. Having a higher maximum is just helpful in so many different ways. One situation I can think of is you're generating more ATB than you can hold on to at a given time. It also allows you to do more abilities in a row, which certain materia will give you ATB if you fulfill those conditions, and it will generally feed back on itself much easier with 3 ATB bars. But if you were to choose only one character that you could put Refocus on, who would you choose? There's definitely plenty of arguments for every character. And for Yuffie and Sonon, it's not even possible to obtain that materia in intermission, so they're not part of the discussion. The best candidate for Refocus, in my opinion, surprisingly, is Barret. Firstly, his inherent design just gets around one of Refocus's drawbacks, which is upon death, you lose it, and you can't get it back even after a revival. So Barret, with such a high HP stat and self buffs, he is the least likely to lose Refocus. Secondly, it actually fixes Barret's problem of not being able to deal damage with his own abilities. Since many of his abilities take as much ATB as you give them, and it scales damage with it, you can very easily stagger an enemy with a triple ATB focus shot, or chunk down a good amount of health on a staggered enemy with a triple ATB maximum fury. And so with Refocus activated, I think Barret genuinely becomes the most well-rounded character in the entire game. He can hit aerial enemies without any issues. He can survive very heavy hits. He can pressure by himself. He can stagger very easily by himself. He can deal a lot of damage by himself. I guess this discussion doesn't really matter in the end, though, since you can get triple Refocus materia to put on every party member. So yeah, that's limit breaks.
You're not getting out of this one alive.
No way!
we've talked about individual characters a bunch and their abilities, let's talk about the team combinations. And thank goodness this game only has 4 possible combinations of parties, so that way I can take the time to go through and talk about every individual one. I think for the main game's battle segments, pretty much every team combination the game gives you is far more than enough to deal with whatever combat scenario that the game throws at you, even on hard mode. But I think the most interesting thing isn't necessarily the team combinations the game provides for you as you go through the story. Rather, it's when you get to the end game content for the VR battles. The game lets you choose any combination of 3 characters, and this opens up some interesting opportunities to experiment around the main story doesn't really let you do whatsoever. The way that the story works in 7 Remake, being a remake of the original Midgar section from FF7, since you couldn't choose whatever party members you wanted in that original section, the game does not provide you really any opportunities in the game where you can swap between a choice of party members for your party. The only exception to this is the Sephiroth fight, but that's only because you make certain choices earlier in the game that affect what party members will show up during that fight. And while I think all of the team combinations work well enough, there's clearly just some combinations that are way better than other ones. Now, playing the game in hard mode for the first time, I did some personal theory crafting. I was just going through the chapters and came up with the idea that Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith was able to deal the highest amount of damage possible. And so it kind of seemed like a no-brainer as to how to kill bosses incredibly quickly. And sure enough, I checked FF7 Remake speedruns on YouTube, and I was on the money there. It is actually crazy how much damage that you can do with this party combination, and you don't need to put a lot of effort into it to play it very well. I think it's not only just a well-rounded team combination and has no real major drawbacks, but is a good showcase, I think, for almost all of the game's major mechanics. The only real weakness of this team setup is that since you lack Barrett's inherently tanky nature, that the margin for error is just generally lower if you manage to screw up somehow. But when you can just spit out damage like crazy and have bosses just absolutely recoil from having your spells casted, does having that extra little bit of tankiness really matter if you're not getting hit in the first place? Which brings me to what I'd like to jokingly call the discount version of this team combination, which is Cloud, Tifa, and Barret. This is a pretty alright team combination. You're not going to get that crazy magic damage with Aerith. You're going to have something that generally is going to have a lower damage output, but you still obviously have that great team structure of having 2 high damage dealing characters and then 1 character that's absolutely adding to Stagger and building up that percentage. I think the biggest advantage of this party combination isn't necessarily anything about the party itself, but rather just overall player familiarity. This team combination pops up a lot in the main story, and so players that are just starting hard mode will be the most familiar with this team combination. It will get through almost all of the end game content and can actually spit out a good amount of damage if you just give Barret refocus. There's not really any major drawbacks specifically regarding this team other than, it's obviously worse than the best one. However, since this isn't the original FF7, we can have a team that doesn't feature Cloud. Oh my gosh, that opens up so many possibilities. So how does the team combination of Barret, Tifa, and Aerith hold up? Unsurprisingly, it's just a worse version of Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith again. You don't get the insane damage output of Cloud in exchange for Barret's tankiness, which is fine. And the final team combination, and in my personal experience, the absolute worst, is Cloud, Aerith, Barret. What makes this team combination so bad is just the lack of Tifa. There's no Tifa to build up that stagger percentage to get it higher and higher. And so while on paper that Cloud, Aerith, and Barret can do more damage just in terms of raw numbers before the actual multiplier hits, if you know how math works, being able to just output more damage does not outpace multiplication. In order to be a competent team, requires the most amount of min-maxing to really make work. Really obsessing over your armor choices, your materia choices, and whatnot. This combination really is the only one where it actively kind of stresses me out when I'm trying to use them against a VR boss, because if I don't do specific attacks at the exact right time and I have all of my ATB bars used in the exact right way that I might potentially die against these bosses. You can see in the gameplay footage how much I am struggling right now with this team. Whereas with every other team combination, I feel like I can make a couple of mistakes and not be super duper worried about it. Why this combination sucks so much is easily explainable, because this party combination does not exist in the main story at all. And so it probably wasn't on the developer's list of priorities to design a party combination like that works well together. So overall, for team combinations, you have a clear definitive best one that I really enjoy playing a lot. You have two kind of middling ones that are fine. They'll get you through the content, but they're nothing really to write home about. And then you have Cloud, Aerith, and Barret, which is the worst combination. I really don't recommend. It's interesting to just see how these characters synergize, but it doesn't really feel like there's a game plan there when you're using this party.
You got this!
My turn.
And that's it for the video. I hope you learned something new about Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat watching through this whole thing. Whether you're a new player who has never played the game before and you want to jump in and you watch this video to kind of get the gist, or maybe you're somebody who's played the game before and just missed something. I hope I can provide something interesting for everybody. If you're someone who's never played the game and somehow managed to make it to the end of this video, please go out and play this game. Buy it, borrow it from a friend. I don't really care. Please play this game. It's pretty fantastic. I enjoy it quite a lot. Subscribe if you want to stay up to date with all things Combat Comprehensive. If you like content like this and you want to see more, go ahead to my Patreon in the description or at the link wherever it's possible. YouTube keeps changing stuff like this all the time. No Patreon shoutouts as of yet because I just launched. I want to say thank you to everybody that I have talked to about this project with. So I've had a lot of friends and family and coworkers and certain other people that I've shared working on this project with, whether I've sent them video snippets or audio clips, scripts, or even just talked about the concept with. Everybody's been really supportive and like really believes in me getting this done, not just in terms of like this individual project, but any sort of thing like this going forward. I've been working on this project for 2 years now, and it's been really hard to just stay consistently motivated through all the phases of that 2 years, working on it in my free time, a lot of writing, a lot of research, a lot of gameplay recording, audio recording, editing. I really appreciate everybody who has supported me, because this has been really a long, enduring process of just not only making something like this, but also figuring out a process. So I want to say thank you. So anyways, that's it, and have a good day.